Hello and welcome to our podcast here at WIPEC, dealing with the Ukraine-Russian war. As always, I welcome political scientist and expert for Eastern Europe, Professor Gerhard Mangott. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's the end of June 2023, and we are well into Ukraine's long-expected summer offensive to take back the country from the Russian occupiers. What are the latest news and how is the offensive going in your way?
Well, maybe some have expected that the counteroffensive, which roughly started 3 weeks ago, would produce an immediate victory for Ukraine on a broad segment of the front. This has not materialized, but I think this expectation had been wrong from the very start. The Ukrainian armed forces have tried to seize territory on various segments of the front, particularly in Zaporizhia and in Donetsk, these two Ukrainian regions. Well, according to their own statements, they have regained control over about 140 square kilometers. That's not very much, but of course, the Russian defense lines have been very properly prepared. They have anti-tank trenches, they have anti-tank installations, they have minefields. So it's difficult for the Ukrainian forces to move forward. And so this slow pace of regaining control over Russian occupied territory is no surprise. We have to say, though, maybe a little bit more could have been expected. Even President Zelensky says that we have wished for more. But it would be much too early to say that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is failing. That's absolutely not true, because it's at the very start that Ukrainians have not made use yet of all their weaponry, of all their Western-trained armed forces.
In my view, the Western media put quite a lot of pressure onto the Ukraine with all the expectations they raised into this offensive. Military experts like Oberst Reisner and also, like you just mentioned, warned over and over again to underestimate the Russians and to overestimate the chances of this offensive, knowing that an attacker needs 3 to 4 times the manpower to overcome a well-prepared defender. What do you think about this media hype in the West?
Well, understandably, Western media are, of course, very much in favor of Ukraine in this conflict with Russia, in this war of Russia against Ukraine. That's understandable from a moral point of view, maybe not from the point of view of objectivity. So everybody seems to be of great hope that the Ukrainian counteroffensive will be successful, or not everybody, but many people do. But maybe their expectations have been not very proper, expecting a rather fast breakthrough of Ukrainian armed forces. This has not materialized. There is fear in the Ukrainian leadership, as far as I know, that if the counteroffensive will fail or will not produce really substantial gains, then some Western countries might increase the pressure on the Ukrainian leadership to start negotiations with the Russian side, at least about the truce. If these rumors that we can hear from many sides are correct, it's hard to say, but definitely it will be difficult for some Western countries, particularly for the United States, which is entering a pre-election campaign, to sustain the military and financial support that Ukraine has received over the past 16 months, because in the United States, some Republicans and even some Democrats are opposed to continue financing and aiding Ukraine in that very scope. So it might be true that if this offensive doesn't produce substantial results till, say, October, this rumor might be true, that then the pressure on Ukraine will increase to start negotiations with the Russians.
What is the stance on fighters, on fighter jets? Because, as I mentioned, many military experts say that without a proper air force, it's very difficult for the Ukraine to succeed in any offensive.
Well, that's correct. I mean, the very fact that Ukrainian forces have not gained a lot of territory, and quite some of their equipment has been destroyed, is due to the fact that Russia is now using its air force, fighter jets and attack helicopters to damage or destroy Ukrainian weaponry. And this is possible at the front line because the capabilities of the Ukrainian side in terms of air defense at the front line are quite limited. Air defense is mostly focused on Kiev and other big cities, but on the front line, air defenses of the Ukrainian side are quite limited, and this allows Russian air forces to be quite active, and that explains why, yes, the counter-offensive is moving forward so slowly. So Ukraine will definitely need Western fighter jets. Everybody's talking about US F-16s. And the training of Ukrainian pilots on F-16s has allegedly already started, but even the most optimistic observers say this training will require at least 4 months, if not more. So it will take time until Ukraine has pilots who are able to fly the F-16, and then it depends on how many and how quickly Western nations provide F-16s to the Ukrainian Air Force.
So what exactly happened last weekend? Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner group staged a coup, probably due to the fact that a mercenary group was about to be integrated into the regular Russian army on July 1st. Was there a real threat to Putin's power? Did Prigozhin have any important allies within the Russian political elite?
Well, it seems that it's fair to say that this mutiny was an armed rebellion, and maybe the aim only was to force Putin to sack Defense Minister Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Gerasimov. Maybe that was his limited aim. But of course, when he ordered parts of his fighters to march on to Moscow, this of course was also a challenge to Putin personally. I don't think that Prigozhin had an interest to bring Putin down, but by doing this, or by starting this military rebellion, he put Vladimir Putin seriously under threat. So maybe the intention was not a coup d'etat, but the consequence of the mutiny could have been a coup d'etat. Well, Putin's authority actually is already damaged by the events that we have seen. We need to know that many in the Russian elite think Putin is responsible for this escalation because Prigozhin over the past 10 months has increased his criticism of Shoigu and Gerasimov, very rude criticism. He said these are incompetent, corrupt people, and their miserable strategy in the war against Ukraine is responsible for the fact that so many Russian soldiers have been killed or seriously wounded, and he increased his pressure by the week, and Putin let him step over red line after red line, and Putin did nothing. He simply watched from the back, and only this very big lack of leadership on the side of Vladimir Putin has allowed Prigozhin to go forward with this mutiny. So this has damaged Putin's respect among the elite. If Prigozhin had people who aided him or supported his mutiny, it's difficult to say. We have a lot of rumors that General Surovikin, he is a previous commander of the Russian forces in Ukraine, since January, a deputy commander of the Russian forces in Ukraine, who is an ally of Prigozhin, allegedly was involved in the mutiny, helped prepare the mutiny. But we need to say these are rumors, that he was arrested. It's also rumors that he aided Prigozhin. What we do know as a fact is that Surovikin, in the night from Friday to Saturday, called upon the Wagner fighters to stop their mutiny. So it's difficult to say if Surovikin was indeed involved. What we do know is Surovikin is also a vocal opponent of Shoigu and Gerasimov. So he definitely shared Prigozhin's and other generals' negative view of the leaders of Russia's military. That's for sure, but that's not well evidence that Surovikin indeed was involved in the mutiny, but the following days will tell us more.
So what was the role of Lukashenko in this uprising on last Saturday? Was he really as important as it seems?
At least Lukashenko claims that he was the relevant actor in the deal that was made on Saturday evening on ending the mutiny. We don't have independent evidence that Lukashenko was indeed crucial. Only Lukashenko claims to have been the crucial actor. He claims that Vladimir Putin wanted to crush the Wagner rebellion, wanted to kill Prigozhin, and Lukashenko claims that he convinced Putin not to do so. And Lukashenko, started to get in contact with Prigozhin. Took quite a length of time to convince Prigozhin to agree to the deal proposed by Lukashenko. It remains to be seen in the future if we will have further real evidence, independent evidence that Lukashenko indeed was, as I've said, a crucial factor. If other people were involved, there are rumors that the governor of the region of Tula, Alexei Dyumin, who has a background in the military's defense intelligence agency, was also involved in the negotiation. Of course, Lukashenko is bragging about his role because this increases his standing vis-a-vis Putin. He now can claim that he is not Putin's poodle, but he is an independent politician who has been very helpful to Mr. Putin when he was in a deep crisis.
How important is the Wagner group for the Russian war, you would say? I mean, in the beginning, they were obviously very important, especially in the attack on Bakhmut, but as far as I've heard, they lost a lot of soldiers there, and their ranks were filled up by like criminals, which were kicked out of jail for a 6-month deal. I think they had to do their duty for 6 months, and then they are free to go. So how important is this group now for the Russians?
Wagner was important for the war in Ukraine. They are very effective, very well trained, very well equipped. And as we know, of course, they get the weapons and the ammunition from the Russian Defense Ministry, so from the state budget. So this makes them a very effective military grouping. Losing now Wagner in the war in Ukraine would, of course, mean a weakening of Russia's capacity to repel the Ukrainian counteroffensive. But we need to wait and see what will happen to the fighters of the group Wagner. Putin has offered them various choices. Either they can demobilize and return to their families, they can join the Russian armed forces or other Russian security bodies if they have not been part of the mutiny, or another option that was given to them was to go to Belarus, where Prigozhin is now in exile, at least for a while. So we need to wait and see how many Wagner fighters will actually join Russia's armed forces. I don't think it will be too many, because the Wagner fighters have been, like their leader, very much opposed to how Shoigu and Gerasimov waged this war. And of course, the money they would be paid from the Russian army would be much less than Prigozhin paid for them. So it's very likely that this fighting capacity will be weakened significantly by Saturday's armed rebellion. And that, of course, the Russian side will feel, but I don't think it is possible to say that even without any Wagner fighter, this will be a game changer now in the war in Ukraine. The Russians do have about 300,000 personnel in Ukraine, and so missing 20,000 Wagner fighters is, of course, something they would have liked to prevent, but they can sustain their defense without the Wagner group. And we need to say we have a lot more other paramilitary formations, Russian paramilitary formations that are fighting in Ukraine, like Redut, for instance, which is not publicly known, or well known among the experts, of course, but not widely publicly known. This is also an armed formation which has evolved from Russia's defense intelligence agency and is cooperating closely with the Russian army. So there are other groups, not as big in size as Wagner has been, but still there are others.
What do you think of the proposal of the European Parliament's request that NATO should invite the Ukraine to join the pact as soon as the war is over? To me, it on the one hand helps the Russian propaganda, and on the other hand, it will make Russia fight even fiercer, because they know if they lose, then the Ukraine will be part of the supposed enemy. At least NATO officials seem to be more hesitant at the moment. Of course, such an invitation can be made in the future, but as long as the war continues, this burden is of great disadvantage to Ukraine, in my view.
Well, there seems to be consensus now among the NATO member states that Ukraine will not be offered a membership action plan at the NATO summit in Vilnius on the 11th and 12th of July. It will not be invited to join NATO at that summit. But what will be decided at that summit is that the support, the military and financial support of Ukraine will be long-term, and it will also be signaled to Ukraine that once the war will be over, there are good chances that Ukraine will either receive bilateral Western state security guarantees or membership in NATO. So this how the way will proceed after the war is over is still debated among Western nations. Well, as you said, correctly said, if Russia gets the impression that Ukraine will join NATO once the war is over, there's a big incentive for Russia to sustain the war, to lengthen it, and thus prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. That's for sure. Well, the European Parliament has passed this resolution asking NATO to accept Ukraine as a member as quickly as possible as after the war will be over. To a certain extent, it surprises me that the European Parliament would vote on such an issue. This is not an EU issue. This is a NATO issue. And this remains true despite the fact that about 23 members of the European Union are or will be members of NATO very soon. So it was surprising to me that the European Parliament addressed this issue. What was also surprising to me is that many Austrian delegates to the European Parliament have supported this resolution as well, which is quite interesting for a neutral country.
Since the start of the war, we had at least two major attacks on critical infrastructure. One was the bombing of Nord Stream 2, the other one, the most recent destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. Concerning Nord Stream 2, it seems likely that it was conducted by the Ukrainians, and that several secret services might have known in advance that an attack would occur. With the dam, the investigations are undergoing, but many indicatives point to Russia being the culprit. What are your informations on these two incidents?
Well, we do know, due to publications in the US media, that the Central Intelligence was aware of the fact that the Ukrainian side was planning an attack on NS1 and NS2, and they have warned the Ukrainian side not to do that. This is what we definitely know. Well, private investigations by Western media have indicated that there is evidence that Ukraine was involved in the destruction of the gas pipelines. It's difficult to say who had knowledge of these plans, but we don't have now already substantial evidence that it was the Ukrainians. But of course, the Ukrainians, like the Poles or the British or the US, had interest in destroying these pipelines. It's hard to say what interest Russia would have had in destroying their own pipelines. And I'd say if Russia had committed this attack, we probably would have already been informed about that. The very fact that there's still no conclusion about what happened almost a year ago indicates that maybe some countries are believed to have been involved in the attack that should not be publicly attacked or publicly mentioned. As far as the dam is concerned, there is great likelihood that it was Russian action. Well, the reason why Russian would have made the dam collapse is that with the flooding waters, a Ukrainian counteroffensive from the right bank of the Dnipro River to the left bank, which is still Russian controlled, will be impossible for considerable time. And so the Russians would have had the advantage of, well, shortening the front line, where they would have to be prepared to defend against Ukrainian attacks. But on the other hand, destroying the dam also means that that Crimea will be in a precarious situation as far as water supplies are concerned. And the floods of the destroyed dam have also destroyed Russian defense lines on the left bank of the Dnipro, and swept away the trenches, swept away the mine fields. So these are disadvantages for the Russian side as well. This could be a reason why Ukraine committed the attack, namely that Russian defense lines would be destroyed. On the other hand, the disadvantage for Ukraine would be that this will mean long-term undersupply of water for southern Ukraine. So even if Ukraine is able to liberate its territories, these regions will be under water stress for quite a lot of time. And what also speaks against the Ukrainian thesis is that, well, as I've said before, what the advantage for the Russians would be that no counteroffensive of the Ukrainians across the Dnipro River will be possible is, of course, a disadvantage for the Ukrainian side. And military experts say that the dam could only have been destroyed by a detonation inside the dam, but not by artillery attacks from the Ukrainian side to the front of the dam. I personally am not a military expert. I'm not an expert on hydroelectric power stations and dams. So I can just, well, report that most of the observers and experts say this has most likely been Russian action. At the end of the day, of course, whoever it was, this was a serious war crime, one more in this barbarian war. And as I've said, I don't have substantial evidence, but it's more likely that the Russians have committed this war crime. What is interesting to note is that on day one, of course, most European politicians, from Borrell to Michel, from Stoltenberg to Scholz and Baerbock, said Russia is to blame, whereas the United States for a very long time did not actually make public who they think has committed the attack on the dam. That was quite surprising to me.
How are the several peace initiatives going? As far as I know, there's one from Brazil, then there's another from African countries who met with Putin quite recently. Is there even the slightest chance of success in this moment in history? As obviously both sides don't want to negotiate.
No, I don't think it's time for a successful effort to bring the two countries to the negotiation table. Of course, it's always necessary to use diplomatic means to solve this conflict, but I have to admit I don't see any prospect for any peace initiative, whether it is the Indonesian, the Brazilian, the Chinese, or the African initiative, because both the Ukrainian and the Russian side still believe that they can win this war on the battlefield, so they are not interested in negotiations at this moment. They do say, of course, in public that they would start negotiations with the other side, but both, of course, set preconditions for such negotiations which are unacceptable to the other side. So this means that the proclaimed readiness to negotiate is not credible. So both believe in victory on the battlefield. And as long as this is the case, we don't see any successful mediation in this conflict. When we ask ourselves how this war could end, we can say, a little bit simplified, there are three options for ending a war. Either a third party intervenes and brings the two warring parties to the negotiation table. Second option is that one of the warring parties is victorious and forces a peace solution on the defeated party. Or third option, both warring parties are exhausted and no longer expect any gains on the battlefield, and then decide to return to the negotiation table. But as far as I can say, we are very far away from any of these three options, while the first option, of course, is the most unlikely to happen.
Well, as you already mentioned, we will have US elections next year, and Donald Trump already said that he will end this war in 24 hours. So we will see how that goes. Let's have a look at the global picture. The BRICS countries are getting more self-assured day by day, it seems to me. South Africa, for example, didn't deny Putin entrance for a BRICS meeting that will be happening, though the West put a lot of pressure on that country. Is Western influence fading around the world in this conflict?
We have to say that Russia is definitely diplomatically isolated by the Western countries, but it's not globally isolated. Of course, we need to mention that when resolutions were debated in the General Assembly of the United Nations, and the vote took place on these resolutions, it was about 140 countries which took the Ukrainian side from about 193 nations in this organization. But we had quite a couple of countries who abstained from the vote or didn't take part in the vote. And of course, a couple of countries, not very many, that sided with the Russians. So there in the global south, as it is called, we have a lot of countries who, few of them side with the Russians, but many of them stay neutral, and many of them have not condemned the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And despite Western pressure on countries in the global south, many of them still stick to this position to remain neutral. South Africa has also not condemned the Russian aggression. They have invited Vladimir Putin to the BRICS summit in Johannesburg in August of this year. But as you know, this put the South African government in great difficulties because the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin. And South Africa has ratified the Rome Statute, which is the legal basis for the International Criminal Court. So according to the law, the South African government would have to arrest Vladimir Putin once he enters South Africa. And of course, it's something that South Africa does not want to do despite Western pressure. So we will see if Putin really goes to South Africa, if he just will join the video, or if he will take the risk of getting to South Africa. We have to say 123 countries have ratified the Rome Statute. So Putin's travel plans are limited, of course. There are so many countries where he can't go to anymore. That's, of course, something which is dismay for him, which damages him internationally. But I won't say that Russia is globally isolated, and we need to stress that the West is not the whole of the international system, but there's a very big global West who takes a different position.
Okay, to wrap this video up, one last question, especially for you as an expert for Eastern Europe and Russia. Especially in the internet and social media, I read that some in the West hope that after Russia lost the war, the country will be destabilized and breaks up into several smaller states, which can be controlled more easily. What do you think of that idea, which is bearing the risk of ongoing wars between the successor states, obviously, and the question in whose hands all the atomic weapons will land?
Well, you know, there's some civil society activism supported by some, particularly Eastern European governments, who argue that Russia should be decolonized, that Russia is still a colony and Russia should be torn into pieces in different states. Officially, no Western country takes this position. And actually, I don't believe that even if Russia loses the war, Russia will fall apart. I don't think so. And what we should definitely not wish for is that Russia actually will be utterly divided politically after a defeat in the war. If it is destabilized, if we have warring factions at the top between various fractions of the political and military elite, we can't wish for a destabilized Russia, because Russia is a nuclear state, a powerful nuclear state, and nuclear deterrence between the US and Russia and other nuclear powers depends on factors like stability and predictability. If those factors are gone, then of course deterrence gets weaker and the chance for nuclear war gets bigger. So we should not wish for a civil war or a war of secession in Russia after a Russian defeat, which of course is not yet definite, but could of course happen. And sometimes I'm surprised that colleagues of mine in Germany seem to have endorsed the mutiny of Yevgeny Prigozhin. A German professor said, "Well, I like the smell of civil war in the morning." I was actually appalled by this statement. First of all, because I don't think scientists should take such a position. Secondly, because I don't think that civil war in a nuclear armed state is something we should wish for. I myself, as always, I'm neutral. I'm not supporting the Ukrainian side. I'm not supporting the Russian side as an analytic observer. I just observe what is going on. I make predictions of what will happen. I will tell the audience what consequences certain events or decisions could have. But as an analytic observer, I don't take sides. And so I need to say I'm in a small minority of male and female colleagues who stick to this neutral position. Most of them have taken sides, which is morally understandable, but makes them activists, and they can no longer claim to be scientists as long as they make these activist statements.
Well, that's exactly how scientists and also journalists should act from a neutral point of view. But yeah, today it seems that they have forgotten this. Yeah. Well, thank you for all this information that you gave us today. And yeah, we will be back probably after summer, and then we will talk about the Ukraine and Russia again. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the interview, and I apologize to the viewers that my voice is not exactly pretty well at the moment, but I think it was possible to hold the interview and listen to it once it's online on the YPAC channel and on my YouTube channel.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you too.